We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's edition, we are looking at the ins and outs of Trump's reciprocal tariffs and the fire and fury on the world stage after J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth's visit to Europe. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, LibertyNation.com is the proud sponsor of this here show, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. You're on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we are joined by Liberty Nation's economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So the big topic for the week is, it's not necessarily the overseas stuff. It's not necessarily the executive orders. It's the tariffs that are happening. And you did a great piece on the page of LibertyNation.com. Terrifying or terrific. And as far as I'm aware, you're the first person to coin that in print, which I kind of love it. It's a great piece, very explanatory for somebody like me who's not an economist and doesn't entirely understand the tariff situation. And I think across America there is they call it a water cooler debate about tariffs that's pretty much divided. Some people think the tariffs that Donald Trump's imposing are a wonderful thing, and others think that essentially this is just going to cost the average consumer more in the long run. But I wanted to get, because you're a very data-driven guy and you read all the studies, you look at all the reports. Give us your view from 20,000 feet, 30,000 with inflation.
Well, it's very early to say what kind of effects tariffs will have, because remember, nothing has really gone into effect yet except for the 10% added tariffs on Chinese goods. But when it comes to reciprocal tariffs, when it comes to the steel and aluminum tariffs, nothing has been enacted. Nothing that's really showing up in the data. You only have, as I wrote in my Swamponomics column recently, is that you're seeing early victories that the Trump administration can take credit for when it comes to tariffs, because now some steel companies are saying, okay, we're going to bolster demand. We're seeing bolstered demand. We're going to increase jobs. The recent Federal Reserve's data of industrial production actually increased on the back of stronger U.S. demand for U.S. factory goods. But overall, it's hard to show what kind of long-term effects that these types of tariffs will have.
Yeah, it's quite a fundamental divide, and it seems that few people can be swayed from one side to the other on this. And just put my perspective, we did talk about this off camera earlier, Andrew, but Trump's announced the reciprocal tariffs. That just to spell things out, what that means is if Brazil charges an across-the-board 8% tariff to the U.S., then the U.S. is an 8% tariff across the board on Brazil, and that works for every country. Now, in my I'm not an economist, as you know, and I don't understand these things with the same level that you do, which is why I love having you on the show, because it's very expositional for me. It's a very good learning experience. But
I'm getting so many compliments on the show today. I guess I'm very, very flattered.
Yeah, I mean, we'll edit out the compliments later. We're just doing this to make you feel good now, but when it goes out, I'm kidding, we won't. We might. But it seems to me that short of having zero tariffs around the world, everybody doing zero tariffs, the very next best thing is precise reciprocal tariffs, isn't it? Because that essentially levels out the playing field.
Well, that's what the administration and all the administration officials have been saying since day one, is that, especially Howard Lutnick, he's the Commerce Secretary, and he had a Senate confirmation hearing. He was Trump's top salesman during the campaign. He'd go on the media interviews and saying, yes, reciprocal tariffs is what's necessary to level the playing field because all these countries are taking advantage of the United States. Trump, during his powwow with the reporter to the Oval Office, he was giving an example of India and how if the United States were to try to sell Harley Davidson motorcycles to India, then India would slap 100% tariff on those motorcycles. Even on minuscule examples, the European Union, for example, the European Union, they have 10.5% tariffs on U.S. automobile imports. On the other hand, U.S. slaps about 2.5% tariff on European cars entering the country. The White House says, look, that's not fair. That's hurting the United States companies who want to export goods to the rest of the world. So why should we be paying higher tariffs, and we have such a low tariffs. Because you look at the aggregate, I think it's the World Trade Organization data or World Bank, one of the two. They have a list of all of the average weighted tariff rates, and the U.S. is pretty low on that list. I think the average rate is about 2 to 4%. But you look at a country like India, the average rate is about 11.5%. Look at Brazil, about 9%. So on the aggregate level, a lot of countries have such high tariff rates on U.S. goods entering their countries.
So Donald Trump is right in a way. The U.S. is being ripped off by these tariffs.
I'm not going to delve too much into that because that's pretty. It's subjective whether the United States is being ripped off or not when it comes to because look, the United States is the world's largest economy. It has a strong dollar. U.S. has such strong purchasing power on the world stage. Forget the macro and microeconomics of it. But the world stage, U.S. has just a strong purchasing power. It can buy all these goods from the rest of the world at such a low cost. I mean, even you look at the export United States export data. The U.S. even exports deflation to the rest of the world. Because last month's number showed a 0.2% increase, but import prices were up more than 1%. That's a different discussion. Maybe
that's a story for another time, children. So let's dig a bit deeper on understanding what these tariffs are and how they work. So and I will come into another great article that you wrote on Liberty Nation, which was what is the sovereign wealth fund and how it works that Trump's proposing. And so let's use the example that you did with European cars. So there's a 10% tariff on roughly 10% tariff of cars going into the Eurozone area. So if a car costs, just for example, $100,000, then it's $110,000 going in. Where does that $10,000 go? That goes to the government, right?
Yeah. So the company that imports that product, they pay the tariff, and that goes to the government. So
Okay.
So let's look at the United States. So the U.S. importers, when they pay these tariff rates, they generate about $80 billion a year for the United States, just because based on that low tariff. So if you look at long-term forecasts, if those tariffs are implemented, the United States could collect about at least $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Some estimates are even more liberal, saying about $3 trillion.
Okay, so essentially these tariffs are putting money into government coffers.
Yes.
To spend as they wish. And at the moment, with almost every country, the US is paying money into almost every other country's coffers at a greater rate than it's receiving money from these countries. And that's where the imbalance comes from, right? That's the trade imbalance.
Well, you're talking about a trade deficit. Now, there's so much bells and whistles about the trade deficit. Jameson Greer, he's the U.S. Trade Representative, and he was on Capitol Hill and during his confirmation hearing, and he was saying how the trade deficit is a grave threat to the United States. But the trade deficit, just basic economics, trade deficit. Everyone has a trade deficit. I go to the supermarket and I buy goods. I have a huge trade deficit with the supermarket because that supermarket is not buying goods from me. I'm buying goods primarily from that supermarket. So I think there's a lot of hoopla. What's the phrase that people say? But anyway, there's a lot of
Al Pacino would pronounce it hoo-ha.
Fine. There's a lot of hoo-ha for the trade deficit. Trade deficit is not something that bothers me so much. I mean, President Trump, he's in the White House and he always says how the United States is subsidizing Canada to the tune of $200 billion because of the trade deficit. Although that number is exaggerated. The number is more about $50 billion a year in the trade deficit. But that's only because United States importers are importing more oil from Canada. That's why there's a trade deficit. But it's not that the taxpayers are subsidizing another country. That's not the case. It's just that it's just exchange of goods and services. Now, you can go in a broader discussion that perhaps, okay, maybe tariffs can play a role why countries are importing or exporting more or less, or, the value-added taxes are exacerbating conditions, whatever the case. But trade deficit is not U.S. taxpayer resources going to another country.
We're going to continue this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.